Nikki said, hi, Simon, Mike, good luck today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Benita, we're just about at the hour. Do you want to maybe give people a couple of more minutes, or I think people are still joining, right?
Yeah, people are still joining. I think we could wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
We'll start in a minute or two.
Okay, maybe we get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar on navigating logistics in times of uncertainty. Happy to be here and excited to have Mike Indesano, Chief Business Officer for the Front Door Collective here. He's got his background from a number of years in FedEx, Amazon, Walmart. I think if you look him up, you'll see all the experiences. So we're happy to have him here to help us talk through some of this. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks, Sam. Good to be here.
So we wanted to kind of start off with talking about the impact of uncertainty in logistics and supply chain in general. But before we jump there, maybe talking through a little bit of what we're seeing in terms of why supply chains have become more fragile over the last 20 or so years, 2 decades or so. Mike, what are your thoughts? What are you seeing and what can you share with us?
I mean, I think one thing, and some of it comes with customer expectation, maybe how long, we've moved to fast fashion or customization. But in all of that, I think that a tremendous amount of slack has been pulled out of supply chains to meet customer demand. So things need to move faster. And that leaves less room for error when something goes wrong. So,
and what about kind of the whole globalization impact on that as well, right? As we start to see that extension, things being moved to China, you're kind of adding more legs in the supply chain itself and more steps along the way that potentially, like you said, you're trying to move things faster. You've got longer lead times, longer legs to work through, and more complexity that impacts that as well.
Yeah, there's also some unaddressed issues. I mean, when hasn't there been a problem with the port? Just wait every couple of years, and there's some type of port congestion that creeps up, be it something with a labor contract or some shift. It just seems like if it's not an annual event, it's every few year event. I remember during the first Gulf War, Fred Smith and others were out there talking about the need to move away from fossil fuels, how critical it was to our long-term security to shift away. And here we are, 20 years later, and we're faced with, fuel shortages and increasing price of fuel around the world and what that's done to supply chains. I think, driver shortage. I mean, it's been discussed for 15 years at least that more drivers were leaving the industry than were entering the industry, and that we would end up, someplace where we are today, where capacity is tight, and just all of that modernization hasn't happened fast enough. So I think there's legacy problems as well that have caught up with us.
Absolutely. And then I guess if we take that a step further, kind of talking about just in general, in terms of the uncertainty and the impact on the supply chain, given some of the stuff that we're seeing today, the number of events that are occurring or have occurred in the last decade versus, let's say, even the last 2 or 3 decades. The impact across the board, we're seeing the wars, COVID that we're hopefully maybe potentially getting out of, the war in Ukraine, the number of earthquakes, other things that are impacting the global nature of that supply chain, and how that actually affects people at home, and they don't realize it as much, but those little disturbances 10,000 or 15,000 miles away can have a pretty big impact on us. So any thoughts there?
I mean, I certainly think I've been in this field for over 30 years, and certainly in the beginning, and granted, I had a much narrower view of the world, but I don't remember events like this, not to this scale and magnitude. I mean, and the pandemic and what that has done to supply chains and how we think about supply chains and how we think about goods and services or even interacting with the world it's amazing impact. So
I think the other aspect of it, if we were to kind of think through maybe even the demand side of it, where you're seeing a lot more demand. Delivery, typically supply chains ended at the store, and people will go to the store, pick up stuff, and then go home. Now everything's going to your door. So the endpoints have exponentially increased. And with that increase in endpoints, now as a logistics company, I'm not dealing with, 15 locations on the East Coast or 20 locations that I'm shipping to. I'm dealing with 150,000 locations that I might be shipping to or more potentially. So that's increased kind of the impact of the demand on the logistics network. And that's caused, of course, we're seeing those changes with e-commerce and everything else. But that's sort of, like you said, that the shortages coupled with maybe the demand has exacerbated the problem significantly or exponentially, potentially.
Yeah, complexity, scale, supply chains have just grown. The time has shortened. It's all just created an environment that is more susceptible to the impact of variation, not as, less resilient, I would say.
And even using some of the traditional methods, I know you use USPS with postal injection for some of the deliveries. Where do you see that kind of going, given the stresses in the market? Is that a viable option as other companies and everyone starts to deliver to the home? Can that scale, or do we start to see issues there as well?
It's interesting world to me. When I think back to my time at Amazon, and certainly plenty of brilliant people there had the foresight to recognize that capacity in the e-commerce space for delivery of e-commerce wasn't being added as fast. It was not keeping pace with the rate of growth of e-commerce. And I was a doubter, even though I was there at the time, and I was tasked with helping to solve that problem. But I thought for sure that companies like UPS, FedEx, the Postal Service would just continue to add resources, and that's just not been the case. And they've now made, in all cases, or at least the first two have made a strategic choice that they're going to focus on margin, focus on efficiency within their network, and let the market deal with the rest, I guess. So I can't imagine what the pandemic would have been like if Amazon hadn't built out their own delivery network. As it was, there was insufficient capacity to meet the demand. So what would it have been if they're now the largest or second largest delivery carrier in the world, and what would happen if that capacity wasn't there? So as far as the USPS, I still believe there's plenty of untapped capacity there as well. But change in leadership, change in perspective, differing view, is the USPS's role to service mail? Is it competing in packages? Cost coverage versus being an entitlement. A lot of those debates, we've seen a shift in the USPS strategy. I think there's viable capacity there. I've always viewed them as a strong player and partner, and certainly in two of my prior lives. But their choice seems to also focus on margin, not too different than the other two. What can we do to control costs, with maybe less regard towards service or the impact that has on the consumer base. So
what's your prediction for the future? I guess, where does this go in the next 10 years? What do you see happening?
In terms of small package, it is ripe for disruption. I just view all of that as inviting competition. And so certainly, in my current endeavor, I'm working with Front Door Collective, and I think it's the right time and place to be standing up final mile delivery capacity, first and final mile capacity, as a significant amount of capital is poured into this space. And there's a large number of startups focused on the middle mile, the first mile, the return mile. And I think 10 years ago or 15 years ago, that was just unfathomable that people would take on the duopoly. Clearly it's not a duopoly anymore.
Right. We've seen in the acquisitions and mergers taking place that have started to open up the door a little bit more to kind of a more, at least a nationwide type network that can start to deliver packages. So you're seeing more of that potentially coming on and more disruption in that market space. You talked about small packages. What about food and other channels? Where we're talking about high value goods, potentially food, and just general retail. Where does retail go as we start to see the shift?
Well, retail continues to shift into e-commerce. Maybe with the pandemic, we're seeing some shift back as stores open and people go back. But prior to the pandemic, the trend for retail was on a negative path if you weren't reinventing yourself into the e-commerce space and finding ways to get goods to customers. I think that's just going to continue. Multi-channel seems to be the right way to go. If it's a store presence or finding a way to be close to your customers from a store perspective, but also close to your customers from an inventory placement perspective, if that is, using stores as fulfillment centers, the dark store concepts. I think we'll just continue to see that as you can't, if we're all, or if so much of the world is competing against Amazon, certainly in the retail space, you can't do that with fulfilling, from one point in the country. Your service will be slow and your costs to try and stick something on, or your costs will be high as you try and fly things to make up for the distance. That just doesn't work. There's one thing that's critical these days is how do you get inventory close to customers so that you can meet what is now a customer expectation of faster service. So
that means shifting more of the product closer to the customer, which then puts that burden on logistics to try to get more volume closer to endpoints, and potentially shifting, right? As demand shifts and as preferences shift, you're not only just taking it out there, but you may be bringing it back or taking it from one location to another location because demand patterns have changed, especially in the fashion industry and the apparel industry and some of the other industries. And that adds to the capacity issue as well. So maybe we get a little bit into kind of the industries themselves. And as we talk about e-commerce, that's fulfilling everything these days across multiple industries. What are some of the big challenges? We talked about capacity and potentially the alternatives that exist today and why the market is ripe for disruption. What other challenges does e-commerce face as we start to transition, or specifically in the logistics space, maybe?
Yeah, I've heard and seen and experienced. Part of this is, as I was saying before, e-commerce is often an inventory placement problem. I certainly view it as an inventory placement problem first, and so if you're competing against somebody that's able to get goods in a day or two or three, that ship from store concept seems so obvious. And so many people have tried and found that it's not quite as easy as it sounds. When you have such limited SKUs, store shelving is not as static as inventory in a fulfillment center, where something is placed and it's not removed until it's needed. In a store, people are touching things, moving it around. And so while, you may see that an item is available to be shipped via e-commerce to a customer, when you send somebody out on the floor to go find it, it just might not be there or be where you thought it was. And so that creates its own challenges. I think also in just the underlying economics, the best scenario is going from one to many. I think one to one, but e-commerce definitely doesn't work that way. One to many works well, and certainly one to many works much better than many to many, right? And so therein lies part of the Amazon example. And so part of with ship to store is it's having the right inventory close to the right customer base. Having an item in a store on the West Coast that needs to go to the East Coast has not solved anything for you. So
right. And I think that's part of the challenge. I think a lot of companies that we've been talking to as well are dealing with the challenge of how do I know what inventory to put where? And that they're typically used to having one fulfillment center that they ship everything out of, or maybe two. Now you're telling them I need to be closer to the customer, and two is not going to cut it. I need to go from 2 to 4 potentially 6 down the road as my volume grows, and dealing with that from just the variability, demand variability, the supply variability aspects of it. Getting the product in, and then making sure that it aligns with the demand. And then if it doesn't, being able to shift it around so that you maximize its potential has been one of the challenges.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, also some challenges around ship to store are you still, FedEx, UPS, the logistics networks operate on the same calendar and the same time frame that they used to, that they always have, which is, pickups occurring in the evening. And of course, the ideal time to be using your store is during dark hours. There's a lot of opportunity there to for I would say logistics chains to match new demand, right? Or to create new outlets for certainly for ship to store. Ideal is you get orders, you process them overnight. That's what you're doing in a fulfillment center. Can they get into the customer's hands the next day? How do you shorten that window? I think there's still a lot to be done there.
And in the retail space, we're seeing some of the mall operators and others that are looking at potentially taking that mall space that's unoccupied or underoccupied, converting that into an FC, a localized FC or a micro FC to support those stores in that complex or in that area that allow them to do some of that. The question is efficiently, because the other alternative is you create every store and make every store into a mini FC, or have the technology as well as the processes, like you said, to know where the inventory is and make sure it doesn't move. But that kind of contradicts the whole traditional marketing approach to retail sales, which is I've got a planogram. Those planograms will change as my seasons or as I see things changing. And that means I'm shifting inventory around, which makes it counterproductive to ship from store.
Yeah, I'd say the folks at American Eagle have been making a lot of waves lately. I think they've got an interesting approach, certainly with both Quiet Logistics and Aeroterra pulling back one level from store, reducing inventories in store, making them tighter, but injecting another layer that can replenish stores very quickly, but pulls that inventory out and makes it more suitable for omni-channel. Does it go to a store because it's replenishing something tomorrow, or did a customer order it? And hey, it's easier if we're doing consolidated shipping from a node that's handling a bigger geography. So, and not only are they trying to solve that problem for themselves, but they're tackling it for the industry or attempting to bring solutions to the table for others. It's certainly a world in which economies of scale matter, and I think few or nobody really has the economies of scale that the number one competitor does.
So I think as we talk through retail and e-commerce. You mentioned dark stores. Where do you see that going from a standpoint of, do we see more of that? And what's the purpose? Is it just a warehouse kind of concept or a micro FC that they're creating, which provides that proximity to the customer to try to get the density and the short time windows, or is it more than that?
I think dark stores continue to proliferate. I think the problem to be worked out is delivery from dark store. The notion of point to point, of customer orders one thing and you fulfill it from the dark store, and then you drive from the dark store to their house, doesn't get you to the same economics of, that FedEx, UPS, Amazon, the post office has, where they load up a vehicle at a certain point in the day and they send it out full. That point-to-point, that gig kind of point-to-point transportation solution, it doesn't close, to me, it doesn't close the gap, and I don't see how it scales and ever gets to the same economics is routed delivery. So it's a challenge, but I think finding a way to network dark stores together to pool that volume, it all starts with inventory placement. If you want to do same day, that's about having the inventory there. I was once challenged on how do you do 5-minute delivery? it's an inventory placement problem. Pretty much you have to have the inventory already there,
Right.
at least with today's technology. And so I think dark stores are going a long way to solve the inventory placement challenge with fast and ultra fast delivery. But I think on the transportation side, you have to find a way to batch. And it's interesting. I mean, I've seen like Uber, some of the others use excess capacity during the day to do delivery, and I think that works to a scale. Certainly, Amazon had Amazon Flex, which was the same kind of on-demand driver. I think that was proven to work to a certain scale, and so. But I think the demand here for goods it's going to outpace that scale, and so there's a transportation solution that uh, needs to be available. Hopefully, there will be one soon. So
it's not the crowdsourced. It's more of the, like you said, it has to be the routed delivery to try to get those efficiencies and the economies that we're looking at. But if you were to do that, then the flex that you've got, where we see a lot of dark stores promising 30-minute delivery or 1-hour delivery, that starts to flex because I can't get that density, I can't get that routing and delivery in that 1-hour time window or that SLA or that 30-minute time window. The only way to do that is the point to point, or maybe point to point at the most, unless you've got significant density in a single area. So how do you kind of tackle that problem, and what's the right approach there? Is there something that's, so same day we've seen people have kind of moved to AM and PM type deliveries. It's also, we're seeing more of the scheduled 2-hour window type deliveries that Instacart and others are touting in this market. But we're also seeing some players that are in the market, and the question that a lot of people are asking actually on this webinar, there was a question that was posed about the viability of the dark stores and the short deliveries. When you're talking about 15-minute delivery in New York City, that's one thing. When you move that to Dallas or Denver or somewhere else, that starts to become extremely, even in New York, it's questionable whether you can even make money at that level, because there are two elements, right? The order size as well as the timing, and like you said, the routed delivery.
Well, and I think is where's the right customer need there. You know, there's no doubt if you can adjust that time, the more time you have and the more time you're able to claw back, the more efficient or lower cost, yeah, the more efficient the transportation can be. 15 minutes doesn't leave room for optimization. It's grab and go and it's point to point, but 2 hours could. You know, and so I think the idea is one, finding what the right value proposition is for people, and what do we need. You know, never thought we needed same day. For some things we need same day, it'd be great. But I think there's a lot of difference and a lot of room between one day and same day, but even same day and time definite, you know. And so does it need to be, is it the 1 hour or the 2 hour delivery that we're concerned with, or is it knowing that it's going to be there at 3 o'clock and the certainty around that? So I think there's ways to leverage technology to bring certainty to a short transit time, but maybe a slightly longer promise that leaves room for optimization. Being able to communicate and interact with customers, to me, certainty is more important. And it's interesting. My son just recently ordered a laptop, and I ordered it for him from my account, and he was pinging me the day that it was supposed to arrive. He pinged me 4 or 5 times. What time? What time? What time? Have you gotten any update? Have you gotten any update? You know, it's certainty around delivery that would have been, you know, gone further. Certainty around that promise, and some transparency that would have delivered more of a customer experience.
And I think that's become that whole expectation, right? Today, everyone wants to know not just that I ordered it and it's going to be here on a certain day, but it's also having that visibility. Am I absolutely going to get it? And if so, and maybe it's the whole Amazon experience thing that's kind of changed that pattern, where the expectation is, I know where it is and I know when it's going to get here. And when it's 10 stops away, they're going to let me know. And as it gets closer, I can start to track it, so I know exactly when it's going to be here.
Yeah, I think certainly from a test case or experience, case, the pandemic, certainly quarantine for a couple months at the start of the pandemic, when most of us shifted towards buying our food online because that was about the only way you could get it. I mean, knowing that groceries were going to be delivered 30 minutes, 4 hours, 5 hours, really in the end wasn't that big of a differentiator. I think the certainty around it, being able that somebody made a promise and they met that promise, was certainly more important than how fast it was. Quite often, we had some deliveries that were too early in the day. We didn't expect that. So it sat out on the porch a little bit longer. The certainty was a factor there. When it comes to food, in terms of dinner, prepared foods, that's a different story. Time is of the essence and accuracy is of the essence. But I think that sometimes food distribution, the grocery side of the business, the same lens is being applied to that as it is to ordering Chinese food or a pizza. I don't think that's right.
And I think that's one of the shifts, right, that you're talking about is that we've taken that same concept of I need it now from where I order from a restaurant and I'm going to eat it right away, to the whole grocery business, where we're seeing a lot of the newer companies starting to do that 15, 30-minute delivery, and be able to give you all of that for groceries and a larger SKU set, which creates the complexities of A, you've got multi-temps that you're dealing with, and B, you have to get that point to point. And given margins on groceries, while there might be margins on prepared foods because of the flavor, taste, loyalty, on the grocery side, the margins are a lot slimmer. So getting to that economic value is significantly harder.
Yeah, and I think even on like the food, the restaurant delivery side of the business, I mean, that was also interesting to watch. In many cases, that solution broke and didn't work for people. Many businesses, many restaurants that I've talked to had to pull away from, the solutions that they were using. They either stood up their own delivery service or found a way to incentivize customers to come to their stores because the economic equation was not working for them, and they couldn't stay viable. Which is interesting. So I think there's going to be more disruption yet in that space as well.
Yeah, because I think it's also the chill chain aspects of it, right? You've got not just being able to actually move that product across, but it's also providing the right environment, the packaging, etc., that can maintain those temps that you need to maintain, both whether it's warm food or cold food or a combination of the two, potentially. Yeah. Maybe let's talk maybe a little bit more about electronics and automotive in that space. We're seeing just manufacturing, maybe due to COVID, that's reduced, that's caused significant impact on chip availability, that's impacting obviously the electronic manufacturers as well as the automotive providers. And that's also in two ways affecting logistics. A, because we're seeing not just the availability of the products themselves being impacted, but from a logistics standpoint, even vehicles and other things are now being backlogged. If you need a box truck or something, you have a 6-month to 1-year lead time. If you need refrigeration, that might be even longer. What does that have an impact on in terms of overall logistics?
Yeah, I mean, I think look at it from two different perspectives. One, as a consumer, well, I guess maybe both from consumer perspective. But in the fall, I bought a car. I bought yet another Subaru. I think this is my third Subaru. And this experience was radically different than all of my other purchases. One, there's nothing on the lot to go look at, or I guess all you can look at is show cars, but there's no inventory sitting on the lot. You get a list of what's coming in and whether or not you can live with those options with maybe some modifications. And there's no negotiating on price. Maybe you can on what the value is of what you're trading in, but the price for the car is pretty well set, and it doesn't matter where around town you go. So radically different. Really, you could just go online and click a button and order like Amazon at that stage. So
Absolutely.
but
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no, so I mean, there's a shift there, and I think the second, front door collective, our intentions we're building, first and final mile delivery capability in the arena, and so looking, we're trying to approach this in a very green way, and so looking at electric vehicles for delivery. Well, everybody's looking at electric vehicles. We saw Rivian, that line starts and ends with Amazon. We see BrightDrop and FedEx in that arena. But I mean, the demand right now for clean energy and clean vehicles in the logistics space certainly is outpacing production. And so, that's a bit of a challenge as well. So, and probably infrastructure is the next piece behind that, but certainly around production. So we're talking with people who have prototypes or are about to deliver a prototype, and we're putting our name down and making orders for years out. That's
right.
The industry. How different.
So where does that leave the current providers? So we see the current market, especially in the last mile space, with these DSPs and others that are providing those services, or local courier companies. Given some of these changes, the cost of getting a vehicle, even if I order multiple, when I get it, when it's available, the turns on the older vehicles versus the newer ones, as they start to come in, moving to that greener vehicle as people start to move to a greener environment. How does that affect pricing, cost from a logistics standpoint, and where does that go from here?
It needs to go somewhere. And, I think in the end as well, similar to the Subaru example, but, where's room of negotiation there? Insecurity and delivery delays. I think that it's a good time to be in the rental business. I think that will continue to flourish for some time. But yeah, I there's so many factors in the transportation arena right now that are just lending themselves towards increasing rates, which certainly outside of margin focus is why we've seen that from FedEx, UPS, the post office. Well, now we have just general inflation on top of that, but there are already market pressures that we're pushing.
So as we see these rates rising, what's and the demand to last mile delivery increasing, how do we start to look at this from if I'm in one of these industries and these businesses and I've got to deliver to my customers, what are the elements that I need to look at, and what do I need to flex, and how do I start to plan for the future?
I mean, it's interesting because, first, it's always been, hey, you should multi-source, you should have, more than one carrier that you're dependent upon or that you partner with, as many as you can enable, the better. We're now seeing, right, in this day and age, certainly FedEx and UPS don't want to, even more so. They're kind of adverse to being, sharing a customer base. It seems to be that competition has stiffened even more, and there's punitive incentives if you split your volume with people. So it makes it a little bit harder. But I guess what I would tell people is that they should be taking a risk. There need to be new entrants. And there are a lot of new entrants, both, first mile, middle mile, last mile. There are a number of new players in the market, and today maybe they are not as cost effective as a larger player that has economies of scale, but I would imagine that I would say they're bringing new solutions to the table, technology and certainty and level of service. I would expect to be higher, and they need your investment, your trust, your faith for them to grow, so that there are more options on the table a year or two from now. So I would encourage people to take a look at those. And if it's just being able to give packages in one market, so be it. If there's some way that you can enable them, if nobody uses companies like that, they're not going to be here, and that's part of why we ended up in really the duopoly world that we were in. Interesting now that Amazon, I'm guessing that maybe a little decline or a little back off of the push into e-commerce from customers has left them with maybe a little more capacity, or at least capacity on the horizon within their transportation network. So they look to be opening it up to others, which probably is good capacity for the market, certainly is needed right now, and I'm sure they see that. It'll be interesting to see where they go, but there are a lot of very interesting startups looking to take on, the big ones. And yeah, I would just say use them, see how you can, support their businesses. This is a world where, we should be pulling together. If transportation, logistics, supply chain, it is about critical mass. It is about economies of scale and finding efficiencies out of this economies of scale. And while no single entity has that economy of scale or the same economy of scale as the one dominant player, collectively, you can do a lot of things together. So
that's a great point, Mike. Maybe we open it up. We've got about 15, 20 minutes left. Anything else, Mike? Any last thoughts or thoughts that you have that we haven't already talked through or discussed that you wanted to share?
I mean, it's an interesting time. I mean, it just continues to get more and more interesting. I've been saying it a lot lately, and certainly others have said it to me, the only certainty is uncertainty right now. And it's a tough world to be in supply chain, transportation, logistics, but it's ripe for disruption. It is driving people to do different things, to tackle problems in a different way. Partnership, the word partnership and co-opetition comes up more frequently, which is great, because I think, the longest, long-term solutions are going to need to come from a place where they're win-wins are created, right? So,
absolutely. Well, thanks, Mike. I think there were at least one or two questions that have popped up, so maybe we can start with some of those. One of the questions that is on here is, do you believe the wave of possible regulatory constraints by governments like city councils and focus on safety will snowball beyond just New York and California governments? So some of the constraints and some of the regulation that we're seeing in New York and California, is that expected to?
It's a good question. I mean, generally things, you go back 15 years ago and it started in California, and before too long it was into the rest of the fold. And so you'd look to California to see what was coming. We live in a slightly more polarized world politically than we did then, I would say. So I think we're going to continue to see, there's a whole, technology is outpacing regulation in my mind. I think there's lots of examples, whether we think regulation is good or bad, technology is outpacing. And so where I think, however that manifests, we'll continue to see government step in and regulate. And a couple of places in the country are going to figure it out first, and it will continue to cascade to other places, particularly around areas of safety, be it consumer safety or be it employee safety. So automation, it just happens faster than we can conceive that the risks are.
So I think we're seeing, you talked about driver shortages. We're seeing autonomous vehicles and driverless vehicles coming on the road.
Yeah.
In some markets, they're in test mode right now. We're seeing some markets where they're starting to become available for people to start to ship. Do you see that as a potential solution to the shortages as well?
Yeah, I've said for many years, because I've been asked this question certainly I was asked this question a lot, and when I was at Amazon, and quite frankly, I expected we'd see more of it today than we actually do. Um, but the technology around long haul automation, the idea of tractor trailer going down the highway with in an autonomous fashion, linked together and multiple vehicles. It seems like that's close, being
Right.
done in some places, and it makes a lot of sense. Even I think in the world of truck driving, those long haul jobs where you're away from your family and you're sleeping out of the tractor are the least, generally the least liked. People prefer short haul and being able to get home and do other things, or most. And so there's room for that, for sure. In terms of automating cars and delivery vehicles, there's always, I don't think anybody is remotely close to solving the last 100 feet, which means that there are going to be people in this equation for many years to come. So,
True.
but yeah, regulation is opening some of that up. Drones,
Potentially, yeah. A couple other questions that had popped up. One, I think we've sort of touched on. These were questions that were posted earlier, but I think we've already touched on some of this. What's your opinion on the long-term viability of the dark store fast delivery business model? The final 50 feet is an expensive cost now to charge for and absorb when margins in the grocery space are so minimal. How can they survive for the long haul?
Yeah, again, I think some of that comes down to, can you encourage customer pickup? Can you play with that delivery window so that you can get some batch efficiency, and that's multiple orders going out on a single delivery? I don't see that point to point as sustainable. And I know that there are a number of business models that are emerging that are built on that. I struggle with it.
Right. Just from an economic standpoint, I think you've got three levers.
Yeah, maybe it plays. Does it play at the same scale that it did? To me, there's a point at which that will normalize. So,
and then one of the other questions that was on here is, based on the current global supply chain inconsistencies, along with delays in the manufacturing process, coupled with inflation, what should newer companies, smaller companies, focus on from a technology and innovation standpoint?
I think there's a lot of technologies and companies that are coming to the market that address problems in a more open way. So a couple of them that I'm familiar with and know that the founders, both Pandion and Shipium, are using technology in the package delivery space. Prior, you would be doing fulfillment and you would look to see, hey, what's the cheapest and fastest way to get a package from, LA to New York, and you would print a label and it would be one and done, and so be it. And so you made the decision with the best information that you had, but a lot happens once it hits the road, but the fate of that package was fixed. And these companies are bringing technology to the table that are dynamically looking at every phase that package goes, have conditions changed, trying to bring the most updated service or weather, the most updated information to the table to redirect. There's other aspects, that has presented itself in upstream in the supply chain as well. So I think the technology that's coming to the table that brings multiple paths and enables options, contingency. We'll see more and more of that. And I would encourage people to look towards solutions that allow for variability.
One of the questions that was just posted on here was, any opinion on the current push by unions to unionize warehouse workers spilling over to the already short pool of drivers? Are you seeing anything on the driver front on unionization that starts to shrink that pool or impact that pool in any way, shape, or form?
32 years, those conversations have always taken place. So I don't know that it's any different, but I do think that there is a change. I'm in my 50s. My kids are 30. There's a different, I have a different view of the world than they do, without a doubt. And in many cases, it's generational. And I think we're seeing a shift back towards protection in a group. There's been a big shift. There are some notable examples where companies have had huge profits. I should say the perception is out there that there's a shift in wealth consolidation, and that it isn't shared equally or at the right scale with the people that help produce that wealth. And I think it's an overarching view in today's workforce, or an increasing view in today's workforce, and that makes unions all the more appealing. And if companies are not engaged in the behaviors to have the right communication, or are not adjusting and sharing, there's going to be a new approaches brought to the table that change that scale.
Right.
And I don't think trucking is necessarily, or drivers are necessarily immune to that. So I don't know, but I don't think what we're seeing happening in the warehouse is anything new at all. I think there's elections all the time, and we're seeing more coverage on those elections. And certainly there have been a few name brands that have lost those elections. And so, but I don't think it's new behavior.
Absolutely. One of the other questions on here was, when it comes to last mile delivery, what's the biggest pain point? I think the question was, can you rank, the cost issues, the driver shortages, vehicle shortages, pollution, traffic congestion, or something else?
Last mile delivery. I think some of the biggest frustration that people have right now with last mile is that certainly in the last year, it has been a drastic increase in the cost of last mile, and a drastic decrease in the assurity of last mile. And so, that creates an opportunity for people.
Right.
Rising costs, and it seems like you get less for having to pay more. And then, so I think in terms of, I think it's interesting that there is, in last mile, there have been some notable articles written, some notable discussions, that have taken place over the last 6 months in the press, where their rewards, are the people that are doing the work being rewarded to the degree that the company is, companies collecting fuel surcharges and then not passing any of that revenue on to, their workforce to offset who are really incurring the cost. That's an interesting conversation for me. We have UPS coming up on a labor negotiation. It'll be interesting. It's a drastically different world than it was the last time this cycle happened. So it'll be interesting to see where those conversations go.
Any other questions, or Benita, it looks like something else just popped up. So one of the questions was, in the traditional logistics space, there are well-reported statistics about shrinkage and loss. With the explosion of delivery mechanisms in the last mile, is there comparable data for the final mile?
Yeah, I mean, I think it manifests where Porsche piracy is the thing that stands out the most. Auto theft, delivery vehicles being stolen while the driver isn't making delivery. is certainly something that has been on the rise, but port piracy. And I think that lends itself to disruption as well. So I think in Europe, the idea of pickup and drop off points have been around for a long time. You didn't drive release packages to people's doorstep in most places in Europe. And so customers going to retail centers and picking up their packages. I think that has really proliferated in the US as a result to try and address this issue. Increasingly, you see more and more lockers, different places. There's hub concepts, new pickup and drop off locations. So I think we'll just continue to see that change.
And that helps sort of shrink that. Yeah, and we start to see, because of that hub concept, it starts to reduce that impact from a logistics standpoint and potentially provide some economies that otherwise might not.
And I think companies have changed, and many companies have changed their policies around returns or claims. I don't think the world's as stringent as it used to be. And so now it's, hey, we're going to pay the customer claim and just monitor that customer and see if there can continue. You can use data to do that. And so if you have fraud, then you do something else about it. But I think 15, 20 years ago, it was, there was a finger pointing game and people were less likely to pay those claims. So there's more customer protection around it just because it happens with greater frequency.
I think we're almost out of time. We've got 5 more minutes, but Mike, I wanted to thank you for your time.
Always
It's been
fun
wonderful chatting with you, and interesting discussion. A lot of interesting points around where things are today, what we're seeing in the future potentially, and what you're seeing and where potential levers are for the future, for companies to start to look at their overall profitability, look at how they manage that uncertainty in logistics and supply chain in general. So thank you so much for your time. Take care. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate all of you being on.